Well, welcome everyone to the latest Millennial Insight series online. My name is Mark Catchlove and I lead the Millennial Insight Group. For those of you who are new to Millennial is made up of a family of brands, and you can see those on the screen in front of you. These brands design and manufacture products for the places where people live, where they learn, where they get healed, and where they work. And today we are focusing on the world of work. And we're really pleased to be joined today by our speaker, Dr. Stephanie Fitzgerald. Stephanie is a chartered clinical psychologist, a neuropsychologist, and a published author. Her talk is entitled How 4 Pillars of Health and Wellbeing Can Change Your Employee Experience. Please use the chat box for questions, and I will put them to Stephanie at the end. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Stephanie, especially thank you to you. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Mark. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking some time today to talk about well-being. So my name is Dr. Stephanie Fitzgerald. I'm just going to start with a quick introduction, really so that you know where I can be useful. As we said at the beginning, I'm a chartered clinical psychologist by background. And I'm a neuropsychologist by specialism, which is a very fancy way of saying I'm very interested in the human brain. And I am an associate fellow of the British Psychological Society. So the BPS is the professional body for psychologists here in the UK. So if you like, I wear 2 hats. So that's very much my clinical hat. I specialise in the treatment of anxiety disorders and trauma, although I work across a broad spectrum of mental health issues as a psychologist. And really what anxiety and trauma have in common is the activation of the stress response. So I also do a huge amount of work in stress and burnout and supporting people with symptoms of both of those. So that's one hat, that's my clinical hat. And then my other hat, which is my more corporate hat, is I work as a health and wellbeing consultant. So I've been doing that for just over a decade. And it may not be what you're thinking. So health and wellbeing is often sort of diluted down to lettuce in the canteen, yoga on the lawn. I'm afraid I don't do anything so exciting. I help companies develop and deliver on globally applicable health and wellbeing strategies. So I make sure that everything is medically legally compliant and that it makes sense for your company globally. So often when we have a headquarters in one country, what makes you a kind, caring, considerate manager in the UK, for example, can land you in real trouble or even in court in the US or Germany. So it's really important that we make sure our health and wellbeing strategies suit everyone, and that's really what I support companies to do. And then where those 2 hats combine, where I wear them together, is very much doing speaking. So I talk a great deal about workplace wellbeing. I work as an executive coach, so I support individuals and teams looking at workplace wellbeing in particular, and I write. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed that my company logo is actually made up of pen nibs, all grouped together, and I write a huge amount and I put a huge amount out into the world talking about workplace wellbeing. And I've actually linked to some articles in the set of links that you get after this talk that I thought would be relevant and useful today. I try and put as much as I can out there for free, so hardly anything I write goes behind a paywall. I'm really passionate about making health and wellbeing accessible to everyone. So hopefully that just gives you a little bit of background on me and tells you where I can be helpful. But now let's talk about work. Okay, so if we're thinking about work and when we start our working journey, so most of us will have to work out of financial necessity, right? That's one of those facts of life. But no one ever tells us how to work. No one ever sits down with us and says, this is how you build a happy and healthy career. This is how you get your needs met. This is how you manage toxic teammates. This is how you deal with difficult dynamics. No one ever really tells us how to work, and I find that extraordinary because it's something that we're all going to have to do out of necessity. But no one ever really focuses on that. And so what we're told is get a good education to get a good job, right? But no one ever really tells us what we mean by a good job. And so because we don't know, we're left guessing the parameters, and we tend to focus on salary and status, right? So we focus on the money and how far up the career ladder are we moving, whatever we perceive that to be. Now, the trouble is when we focus on things like this, actually what we know and what the research tells us about trying to build a relationship with our jobs based on money is that we cannot build a relationship with our benefits package. So even the most mindful and grateful employee is only going to feel the impact of an increased benefit once. And that's because our brains adapt very quickly. So if you change role and your new role happens to have a new and increased salary, your first paycheck feels amazing, right? It lands, you do a little happy dance in your kitchen, you're really excited, and your brain's reward centers are lit up. However, the next month, you're still super grateful for the money, but that's now what you earn. That's what you were expecting to earn. There's no sort of happy dance in the kitchen. Your brain goes, okay. And so those reward centers tend to get diminished. And what we know is that actually when we offer people things like spot bonuses or rewards, actually when they're not repeated and we've had that reward center light up in our brains and we get really happy about a little bit extra cash or whatever it may be, and then we don't get it again, we can actually become increasingly dissatisfied and disenchanted with our role. So I'll just share an example here. This is a client that I've been working with, and we caught up just before Christmas, and he was really fed up. And I said, "What's going on?" And he said to me, "I worked so hard organising our winter conference. I went above and beyond. And on the team call, I wasn't even singled out for a thank you. I got a £200 gift voucher last year and a bottle of champagne, and this year I was busier than ever and still pulled it together, and I don't even get a thank you? I know I shouldn't, but I've mentally spent that money. It's unbelievable that I got nothing." So we can see here with my client that I was working with here, last year when they arranged the winter conference, they received a spot bonus, if you like. So they had this £200 gift voucher and they had the bottle of champagne. So their brain's reward center rather was lit up at that. They were very, very thankful. But they couldn't build a relationship with their role around that. But also what's interesting to me is neither did the company. So their manager, because they did it last year, there was an expectation they'd do it again, and it seemed less of a big deal. So actually the manager's reward center in their brain was less lit up. It's like, well, of course they'll do it now. They've done it before. That's what they do, even though it's not technically part of their role. And what we know from the research, this will be no surprise to anyone on this call, the bit that upset him the most was not getting the thank you. He could cope without the money, he could cope without the champagne, but the bit that really bothered him was the lack of gratitude. So what this is telling us is that money is not the most important part, and yet this is what we cling to, right? Salary status, because we're told get a good education to get a good job, and that's what we think a good job means. But actually being told that it's more than money can feel really frustrating, right? Because for companies and for managers, we can think, oh, for goodness sake, what more do they want? I pay them to do a job, they come to work, they do that job, I pay them. What more do they want from me? And I'm really seeing this reversal of attitudes in a way that I haven't seen for over a decade. And some of the conversations I'm having are from managers and organizations who are fed up now. And they just say to me, I just need people to do their job, Steph. You know, we've tried paying for wellbeing initiatives, we've tried throwing money at the problem, it's not working, I just need them to do their job. And I think we're seeing some of that frustration being acted out in behaviours in the workplace. So in particular, things like the mandated return to office. Yeah, so when they're saying to employees who've been perfectly productive and who have altered their lives around work, around the pandemic, for example, then being told, come back to the office 5 days a week, forget the fact that we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis, forget the fact that you have adjusted your life and now don't really have that time to commit to the commute. It doesn't matter, come back. And I'm starting to hear managers say things to me like, well, they're not at work to have fun. And this really took me aback when I first heard a manager say that to me, because I thought, I've got a real sense of deja vu here. And that's because these are conversations that I was having back in 2012, 2013. Okay, so back in the day, I was introduced, this is how I was introduced to the head of an NHS trust board. The National Health Service here in the UK, our public healthcare system, is where I used to work as a psychologist. And we were all going around the table, we were being introduced to the senior leadership team. And I was introduced as, well, this is Steph, she does the hand holding, okay? And it was meant very rudely, and it was meant in a very derogatory way. And it wasn't because I'm a psychologist, they weren't putting down the psychology industry. It's because I had the audacity to care for my team. And in particular, I really focused on my team's health and their well-being. And when I would try and explain this to other teams or to managers or to directors of the trust, I was told, that's the pink and fluffy stuff, right? That's the nice to have. We've no budget for this, Steph. You know, stop talking about health and well-being. They're just here to do their job. And then when David Cameron was in government, he asked all frontline workers, all public sector workers here in the UK, to have what he called the big conversation. So the big conversation was asking those of us who were on the front line to come up with some suggestions and some ideas of things that could save money. Ultimately, that was the aim. So how can we on the front line save money? Now, I work with some amazing colleagues and some fantastically talented people who came up with incredibly sophisticated engineering solutions. So things like lights that would automatically turn off if no one was on the ward, and all these sort of amazing engineering solutions. But I was the only person in the UK that put forward a suggestion that we should do something around staff health and well-being. And my proposal was this: if we take better care of our doctors and nurses, I think our patients are going to get better quicker. I think our sickness absence is going to reduce, and I think our patients are not only going to get better quicker, they're going to go home quicker, and they're going to be less likely to relapse. But I was really taken aback that I was the only person who suggested something around staff health and well-being, and so were they. And they were intrigued enough to say, go on then, you've got £5,000 and 25 weeks to prove it. Okay, now that may not sound a lot of money. I'm aware some of you will have bigger lunch budgets than £5,000, but let me tell you, in the NHS back in the day, that was like being given a bar of gold. It was phenomenal, but also came with quite a lot of pressure. And so, skip to the end, spoiler alert, subsequent research projects have proved this time and time again. When you take better care of your doctors and nurses, your care in hospital is better. And that means you get better more quickly. That means you get to go home more quickly, and you are less likely to relapse and return. And on a practical level, that's because when we take better care of people, we have reduced sickness absence. All the things that are frustrating as a patient in hospital are things like your x-ray getting lost, or your blood test results not coming back quickly enough, or a lack of continuity in your care. These are all the things that affect when you can be released, if you like, when you're allowed to go home. And so when your doctors and nurses' sickness absence reduces because they're happier at work and they're healthier, then that means that you've got continuity of care, which means you get better quicker. And then I was told, okay, we like this, do it again. So I did, went to a different trust, eat, sleep, repeat. Okay, do it again. Do it again, do it again, do it again. And so we started to roll out these health and wellbeing initiatives across the NHS. And then companies outside of the NHS started to approach me and say, Steph, come and do that for us. What are we doing here? Does this work outside of healthcare? And so suddenly I went from, this is Steph, she does the hand holding, to wait a minute, she might be right. But what this was telling me, I've had the privilege in my career of working across so many different industries, right? So when I was asked, does this work outside healthcare? Yes, it does. And we know, and we're on this call because we know that taking better care of our employees yields great results. And I've had the privilege of working across all kinds of different industries, from Premier League football right the way through to atomic weapons, civil engineering, finance, insurance, healthcare, emergency response. I've worked across so many industries. And what I started to notice was that in every one there were 4 key pillars. of health and well-being that I needed people to focus on for their employees. And actually, I decided this was how we needed to rework our approach to work. So we needed to forget status and salary, and we needed to rework how we were approaching work. And this is my fourth book, and this is the book that led to Mark asking me to come and talk to you today. And this is really about how do we utilize those 4 pillars of health and well-being to change our approach in the workplace. And you're probably very familiar with the acronym HSE, so Health Safety Executive or Health Safety Environment, depending on your industry and how you use it. And I've always sat underneath HSE. That's always been my sort of home as a health and wellbeing consultant. And I liked the acronym. I liked how popular it was. I liked it so much I decided to steal it and make it my own. So I started to work with HHSE to describe my 4 pillars. So my 4 pillars of health and well-being were happy, healthy, safe, and engaged. And really, this is designed to provide a different lens for you to start thinking of well-being, a different focus, if you like, for health and well-being, because often I think well-being, the term has been quite diluted. It sounds pink and fluffy now. It sounds a bit nice to have. No one really knows what it looks at and how we can measure it, etc. So I just wanted to put a fresh lens across employee wellbeing and think about happy, healthy, safe, and engaged. So I'm going to take us through those. So let's start with happy. It's a good place to start. So when we talk about being happy in the workplace, it is literally that. It is you experience feelings of happiness whilst you're at work. Okay, so this is when you think about your job, but also when you're telling others about your job. Now, if you've ever had Sunday night syndrome, so by that I mean you're lying awake on a Sunday night thinking, oh, I've got work tomorrow, then that would suggest you're not happy. Unless you're lying awake with excitement thinking, yay, I've got work tomorrow. Then if you've got Sunday night syndrome, it's that feeling of undefinable dread. You don't really know why, but you're just not excited about getting to your desk or getting into your workplace the next day. And sometimes that unhappiness can spread far beyond the working day. So it can occupy our every thought. We can be worried about going to work. We can become quite anxious and withdrawn when we think about work. So you want to be able to experience feelings of happiness whilst you're at work, when you think about your job, but also when you tell others about your job, when you're describing your work. You want to feel happy. Now, we know, and the research tells us, that the best way to feel happiness and a sense of belonging at work is to align to that greater purpose. So we need to understand the part that we play in the bigger machine. So what purpose does my role serve in the running of my organisation? And often I think we really dismiss that. Well, often when we have these conversations, logically we know that, the research tells us that, but we very rarely spend time with our employees talking them through, asking them, how do you feel you align to this company's bigger purpose? And one of the quickest ways to become unhappy at work is to feel a clash of values. So if you don't see where you align with your company's values or with the greater purpose of your role, then that's the quickest path to unhappiness. Now, it's worth saying being happy at work does not mean that you're not going to have tough days, right? It means that in spite of the tough days, your job supports your happiness. Now, this is a really key point, because I don't know when we decided that work was something that was going to drain us, right? That work was something we needed to recover from. I don't know when we sort of developed this mentality of, oh, roll on the weekends because I need to recover from my working day. That shouldn't be the case. What if work could be our charging pad? What if our happiness in our workplace actually came from the work itself, not from leaving it for the weekend or for the evening? What if we could get excited and happy and engaged in our work to the point where it was fueling us for the rest of our life rather than draining us? That was something I really wanted people to be thinking about with these 4 pillars, is how can I bring happiness into the workplace and also take it out to the workplace? How can my work recharge me? Now, again, I'm aware happy is one of those terms where sometimes people think, oh, you know, why does it matter? We're not at work to have fun, Steph. Why does it matter if people are happy? And my simple answer is time. So I apologise, this is one of those stats that should come with a health warning. But a conservative estimate, if you work an average working week, is that across your lifetime, you are going to spend 81,396 hours at work. Now, I mentioned that's a conservative estimate. Some other research estimates put us at about 115,000 hours at work. In a typical working week, we're going to spend more time at work than we do anywhere else, with our loved ones, in our own bed, traveling the world, relaxing, pursuing hobbies and reading for pleasure, not emails. We are going to spend more time at work than anywhere else. And when we put it into that perspective, don't we deserve to feel happiness when we're at work? So that's happy. Let's talk about healthy. So when we talk about health at work and being healthy, I like to follow what I call my do no harm principle. So work shouldn't harm you and you shouldn't harm work. So it sort of goes without saying that work shouldn't damage your health. And I work in a lot of safety critical environments where there are high risks. And even then, all those risks are minimized and mitigated as much as possible to really diminish the risk and reduce the risk of harm. Okay, so work shouldn't harm you, but also you shouldn't be harming work. And I think this is really important because I think we do the first one really well. We focus a lot on what the workplace does and how we can support our employees, but it's a two-way street. So work shouldn't harm us, but we shouldn't harm work either. So in my line of work as a psychologist, I have something called fitness to practice. So fitness to practice is a fancy term really, which means it's not a fit note from your doctor, it's an ethical duty that I am bound to my accrediting body to make sure that I'm fit to do my job as a psychologist. So I am fit to practice as a psychologist. So for example, if I have a life event such as a bereavement, I have an ethical duty to tell my accrediting body that actually I may not be able to support clients for X amount of weeks whilst I process what's happening in my own life, and then I'm duty bound to inform them when I'm actively working again. Now, most industries don't have a fitness to practice. We may get the odd fit note from a doctor, but we don't have this idea of fitness to practice. But I sort of think we should. And I think we should think of it as fitness to practice, because if you have a very stressful and demanding job, for example, and you are doing nothing to look after your health, you are doing nothing to support your ability to do that job well, to manage your stress response, to take good care of your health and happiness, then work may not be harming you, but you may be harming work. Yeah, so it's just something to think about when we think about fitness to practice. Am I doing everything, and are my employees doing everything they can do to support health and happiness in the workplace? Now, if you've heard me present before, or if you read anything that I've written, or you've seen me speak before, you'll know that I bang on about this a lot. So apologies if I'm repeating myself for those of you who've heard me present before. But you'll know that I always talk about health as safety, as opposed to health and safety. And that is because health issues are safety issues. So I don't want to be the passenger on a train driven by a driver with undiagnosed sleep apnea or fatigue. Yeah, and that's because that's a health issue. So you know, the sleep apnea or the fatigue, they're health issues, but the consequence is a safety issue. And often, as soon as I go into companies, they say, we need our health and wellbeing data. You know, we want our health and wellbeing data. And what I will say to them is, look at your safety data. If you gather safety data, that's a really good starting point, because happy, healthy, safe, engaged employees, put simply, do not have accidents. So if you can look at your safety data as a starting point, it's another source of health and wellbeing data for your company to utilize. Now, this idea of health as safety is also really useful to pitch to your senior leadership teams and to get board level approval, because people understand safety in a way that they don't necessarily connect with health. So if you're trying to get buy-in for your health and wellbeing strategy, for example, start talking about health as safety. In HSE, typically the health is whispered and the safety is shouted because people are very aware of the impact of breaking a safety issue or having a safety risk. So if you can start to use health as safety as your framework, then it allows people to make sense of what it is you're trying to do. So for example, existing frameworks for safety issues can easily be converted for health issues. If you have safety briefings, they become health and safety briefings. It's a really good way of introducing those who are not familiar or who are not buying into health and well-being. If you're having conversations like those I've been having where it's, oh, you know, you're not at work to have fun, this is a fantastic way to just reframe some of those health issues to get them thinking about it in a different way. And of course, the healthier we are when we're at work, the healthier we'll be both in and out of work. So what I mean by that is, if we're coping well with what work is throwing at us, if we've got lots of systems in place, if we're managing things well, and we're happy, healthy, safe, and engaged at work, then we're going to remain healthier because we're going to be coping better, our sympathetic nervous systems are going to be better balanced, our brains are going to be pumping the right chemicals rather than all the stress hormones through us. So the healthier we are at work, then the healthier we'll be, and we're going to make good decisions. Now, speaking of good decisions, I just wanted to offer a case study. I always think it's quite useful to have a bit of a case study when we're talking about these things. And I wanted to talk to you about John. So John is an absolutely fantastic engineer. He's worked in his job for over 25 years. I'm not an engineer, so forgive me, I'm not going to drop in lots of engineering terms, but he's phenomenal and he's very well respected. And John was working on a particularly complex piece of machinery that only really John can use. And whilst John was working on this machine, he dropped a tool into the machinery. Now, there are very clear protocols for when that happens. So you turn the machine off, you allow it to cool down, you run cleaning through the machine because there's all kinds of chemicals and some acid in the machine. You let all that cool down, then you use a special tool to retrieve whatever it is you've dropped, and then you can kickstart the machine again. So all of that takes somewhere between 45 to 90 minutes, depending whereabouts in the machine everything is. And John knows that. He actually set up that protocol. He's been doing that so often he could almost do it in his sleep. And then one day John dropped a tool into the machine by accident, and he stuck his arm in the machine to retrieve it. Just wasn't thinking, just put his arm in. Thankfully, a colleague was walking past at the time, saw what he was doing, or was about to do, grabbed him by the waist, yanked him backwards, and said something a little bit stronger than, "What on earth do you think you're doing?" So something along those lines, "What on earth do you think you're doing, John?" And he said, "I don't know." So immediately the process was stopped. John was suspended. Immediately, straight away, he was told, right, to step away from the machine. He was berated by his manager. They, you know, "What were you thinking? Why would you do that? You nearly lost your arm. What's wrong with you?" And John was completely bewildered by what had happened. And as always happens in these situations when no one knows what to do, they called me and they said, "Steph, come and talk." So I sat with John. Now, I never quite know how to say this diplomatically, so please forgive me, but John was a man of a certain age and a certain stature, and he told me that he had steadily been putting on weight over the last few years for various reasons. He had quite a sedentary job, he put on a bit of weight over the pandemic and what have you, and I started to ask John about other risk-taking behaviours. So I said to him, "Have you crossed the road recently and not quite left enough time and sort of had to scurry towards the end?" And he said, "Yeah, I did that the other day actually. I got beeped, you know, by the car when I was crossing the road." I said, have you run any lights recently?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "Yeah, I ran a red light actually the other day. I thought I could make it, but I couldn't." He said, "I had a bit of a near miss." I said, I said, "John, have you been tested for type 2 diabetes?" And it's fair to say everyone was looking at me like I'd grown another head, because here I was to sort out the working dynamic and how they could discipline John, and actually I was there talking about a health issue. But with full support from his manager in occupational health, John was assessed, and it came back that he was pre-diabetic for type 2 diabetes. And this is what I mean by health issues being safety issues. When we have the broader lens of happy, healthy, safe and engaged, when we can look at those through that lens, when we're looking at accidents, when we're looking at interactions, when we're looking at things that are happening in the workplace, then we are better able to understand what's going on. And this is why I talk about health as safety, because that was a health issue, but it was also a safety issue. Now, it's worth saying John is back in role, working full-time, fully supported, blood sugars are well managed, but also he's made some lifestyle changes. But that incident could have resulted in John losing his arm, so we cannot lose sight of the seriousness of that. But what it resulted in was a very positive change, and he is happier and healthier at work as a result. So I just wanted to share that case study to give you an example of the kind of things that can happen when we use this framework. So I mentioned safety and I've talked about health as safety, but it is a given that you should be safe at work, okay? So you are entitled to go to work and come home and not have been damaged by the workplace, right? You should be safe at work. And I work, as I mentioned, in safety critical industries where risks are having to be monitored and mitigated all the time. Now, if you're working in an office or you're desk-based, you might be thinking, Steph, I never think about my safety at work. What are you talking about? Of course I'm safe in an office. Other than if, I don't know, I trip over my laptop bag or something like that, I don't need to think about safety at work. But I'd argue with you there because, for example, 86% of us will hold our breath or shallow breathe when we look at a screen. Okay, so when we open our laptop in the morning or we upload our Outlook and we're looking at our emails, it's likely that our breath changes and our body tells our brain what to do and our brain tells our body what to do. So when we have a physiological change, our brain may become slightly sharpened to threat. So that holding of breath or shallow breathing is going to activate your sympathetic nervous system, so your stress response will be a little bit higher, not drastically. You're not going to open your emails and start screaming unless the content requires it, but it's just adding to that sense of threat from opening your laptop. And when we think how different we feel when we're on holiday, it may simply be that we are breathing properly, that we literally get a chance to catch our breath. Now, some of you will be watching this on a laptop, on a screen, on a device right now, and it's just worth tuning in and paying attention to how am I breathing? And it's worth leaving yourself physical cue reminders, like a little post-it stuck to your laptop or whatever it may be, that's just reminding you to monitor your breath, particularly if you're dealing with something difficult. But I'm talking there about physical safety and some of the impacts. And I mentioned there that the way that we breathe affects our brain. And actually, our breath and our breath pattern can affect everything from our immune system and how we fight diseases, right the way through to our stress response and our threat response, as mentioned. But they tend to be physical safety issues. And of course, we know that within our work environment, we also need to have psychological safety. So psychological safety is essential for workplaces because this is where we get creative. This is where we get innovative. This is where we can challenge. And this is where we make positive change. So had my colleague not felt psychologically safe to grab John and pull him back, had he thought, oh, John's going to scream at me, I'm going to embarrass him, I'm going to show him up, I don't know, then John would have lost an arm. So actually, my colleague felt psychologically safe enough to say, oi, what are you doing? Grab him and pull him back. But hopefully we can also apply psychological safety in less drastic terms, just around problem solving, being creative, being innovative, coming up with solutions together, finding better ways of doing things. And these are all skills and knowledge that your employees will have. And if they're given permission, if they're given this framework of happy, healthy, safe and engaged, and the safety includes psychological safety, then they're really going to be open to this idea of not only is this supporting the workplace, but it's supporting my well-being. And it's sort of back to that do no harm principle, right? Work shouldn't harm us and we shouldn't harm work. So we need the psychological safety to act, because otherwise we're going to be harming work by not bringing forward our solutions, not bringing forward our creativity, our amazing ideas, our new ways of working. We're not going to be bringing those to the workplace. And then lastly, I talked about engaged. Now, engaged can sometimes be a bit confused with excited, okay? And really being engaged just means being mindfully involved in the task at hand. So some of you will be disengaged right now, and that's because you may be watching this on your laptop where you've got notifications pinging at you, or an urgent email's popped up and you're sort of multitasking and you're scanning. And it's worth saying our brain is not designed to multitask. So forget anything you've ever read about gender differences and women are better at it than men or any of that. It's all nonsense. Our brain likes to do one thing well at a time. Okay, so if you are watching a webinar, but you're also checking your emails, you're not doing either of those things well. And it's the more we multitask and the more we don't task and finish tasks, the more we don't sort of, start and finish tasks, the more we cram our brains full of unfinished business that our brain still has to hold on to. And that's why so many of us can feel so overwhelmed at the end of the working day, because we've started 500 things, but we've only finished 2. Okay, so it's worth saying you can be engaged in your work even when you're completing very boring tasks. It's just about being mindfully present with what you're doing. And engagement can feel difficult to measure, because if you ask someone, were you engaged with your work today, particularly if you're senior to them, they're going to say yes. Right? No one wants to say, no, do you know what, I was daydreaming the whole day, I wasn't really paying attention. So what we can do is some simple measures of engagement for ourselves as well as for others would be recalling your last working day in detail. So our brains try and automate as much as possible in order to take the burden, the cognitive load off. So if you can recall your last working day in detail, that means that you are engaged. Again, understanding the role your job plays in the wider company aims is essential here, because you're going to be engaged in your task if you understand the purpose of it. If you don't think it matters, and if you think no one's really going to care whether or not you do it, then why would you do it? Why would you stay engaged with that? You're going to get distracted. You're not going to complete that task. So you need to understand. And again, it's that understanding that leads to us having some pride in our work and being emotionally connected to our work. So I love my job. My passion, my ikigai, if you like, is helping people understand how their brains work and how to utilize that to better support their health and well-being at work. But the day I'm not engaged in that, the day I'm not emotionally connected to that, is the day I go and do something else. Because I need that connection. I need to feel that pride in my work. I need to love what I do and be engaged in it in order to do my job well. So that is our happy, healthy, safe and engaged framework. And I just wanted to give another example here. And this, if you like, is a bit of a permission slip, but I think we can really beat ourselves up about getting to a certain point in our careers or finding a certain element of our working day really stressful, and then we make bad decisions. Right, we feel I'm not doing what I should be doing. I've got all these goals for myself. I want to be happy and healthy outside of work, but work just sabotages me and I get in the way. I get in my own way. And I just wanted to talk about something called amygdala hijack. So amygdala is the alarm bell in the brain, and your amygdala doesn't care about future you. Okay, so the importance of being happy, healthy, safe and engaged at work is that if you're not, and your stress response goes up and your amygdala takes over, then it stops talking to the logical decision-making part of your brain, your prefrontal cortex right at the front of the brain, and it just starts to go wild. And your amygdala doesn't care about future you. So you may have your New Year's resolutions nicely typed out and pinned to the fridge, and they say things like, go for a run after work. Well, your amygdala looks at that and it goes, well, that might be good for future me, but I want to feel good now. And what's going to feel good now is sitting on the sofa, putting Netflix on, pouring an extra large glass of wine and getting a takeout. Right, so your amygdala doesn't care about future you. And I just wanted to emphasize this is quite a new way of looking at our well-being. And when we're pulling these strands together, happy, healthy, safe, engaged, this is a new filter, a new lens to look through in order to understand our health and well-being at work. So if you've been struggling with future you goals, if you felt like work's sabotaging things, it's not your fault, it's your brain's. So we can happily blame your brain for this. Doesn't make it better, but it also means it's not really a choice, it's your amygdala taking over. So how do we start to implement this? So the first thing I will say, and I do think this is one of those things that makes me quite popular as a health and wellbeing consultant, is partly because I have an NHS background. I specialise in low cost or no cost wellbeing solutions. You don't need hundreds of thousands of pounds or dollars to secure employee wellbeing. And that's because there is no external solution to internal issues, right? There's no app or training package or whatever it may be that's going to make everyone suddenly happy, healthy, safe and engaged. Okay, what we need to do is start prioritizing those 4 pillars. Okay, and when we start prioritizing well-being, what we realize is that it's the fuel for our engine. So we would not do a great big long car journey and then fill our tank with gas. We recognize, I need a full gas tank in order to complete that journey. And yet what I've noticed with wellbeing, and again, this goes back to managers, is we see the tank's empty, right? We see it's empty, but we just want more. We just want people to do more. So we're trying to force this, wellbeing, which, it doesn't matter. I can see people aren't happy, they're unhealthy, they're not safe and they're disengaged, but I just need them to keep going, keep going, keep going. What we need to recognize is that we have to start prioritizing our wellbeing in order to hit those goals. So a really good starting point is to ask for meaningful feedback. So I would be sharing these 4 pillars with your employees and say to them, what decisions can you make around being happy, healthy, safe and engaged? And when your employees are making the decisions, they're also making the difference. Now, the reason I put the emphasis on the employees is almost back to that fitness to practice thing, right? It's a joint responsibility between us and our employees. But also, and I talk about this previously, and I've talked about it in Reworked, I don't really understand why anyone would choose to be a manager at the moment. So much is laden on managers. The burden is so strong on managers. It's almost, if you want to know anything about everything, ask your manager, seems to be the answer. And it's so disempowering for people. Right? And disempowering people is not a solution to people being unhealthy or unhappy at work. So when we're ladling things onto the manager and we're saying, ask the manager, actually we're disempowering people to take control. We're removing some of that psychological safety, and we're almost saying, well, you need someone higher up to support and make that decision for you. So that's just something that's worth thinking about. How do we apply some of these pillars? How do we apply some of these? Is to start by asking for meaningful feedback from people. And when I say meaningful, I mean relating to the pillars. I'm not talking about a generic staff wellbeing survey, or maybe your staff survey that has one wellbeing question on it. I mean, start conversations with your teams. How happy, healthy, safe and engaged are they feeling at the moment, and how can they make a difference? When I wrote Reworked, I asked people what they wanted me to talk about. I asked them, what is it that you'd like to know that you would like to rework in your company? And one of the things that came up time and again was company culture. And people said to me, I'm really interested in health and wellbeing, Steph, but I just cannot seem to shift my company culture. It feels too big, it feels unmanageable. And so I wanted to share an example, and because we are all on a Millennial webinar and we probably all have quite a strong interest in the workplace and our working environment and what that means, I wanted to share an example of changing company culture by changing your working environment. So I am a huge advocate and fan of Kaizen. So the Japanese concept of small daily incremental changes leading to bigger positive outcomes. Okay, so a really nice approach is, rather than great big huge scary goals, is to just say to people, let's do something 1% better today. Let's be 1% healthier today, 1% happier, safer, more engaged. And of course, if you do 1% every day, then in 100 days, people are 100% further on than where they were. Yes, so if going for those tiny improvements, and I just wanted to share an example from Reworked about how a litter bin changed company culture. So I got asked to work with a team that was having a lot of difficulty and had become, quote, impossible to manage. They were surly and disrespectful to leaders, they didn't turn up on time, and they were deliberately unhelpful around customer demands and deadlines. The manager felt completely overwhelmed and had no idea how to continue working with their team. When I arrived on site, the disrespect for the workplace was visible. The area around the building that the team was based in was covered in cigarette butts and litter was blowing around all over the place, and I knew what I was starting with. So I got introduced to the team and I asked for a site tour, starting outside. And as we were walking around, I just stopped and picked up the odd drinks can or crisp packet that was blowing around, and the team leader noticed what I was doing and said, "Are you okay, Steph?" And I said, yeah, absolutely. I'm just grabbing this. Like, you deserve better than having this blowing around your feet. I didn't say anything else. I didn't ask anyone else to pick anything up. I just kept walking. Every day I worked with that team, I asked someone to walk me around the site, and I picked up 1 or 2 pieces of litter and I put them in the bin along the walk. I never asked for help or told people to clear the litter. However, the change started. Every day on my walk around the site, other people started picking up 1 or 2 pieces of litter with me. One lunchtime, 5 members of the team announced they were going to sort out the outside, and they grabbed litter pickers and brooms and they swept the area clean. That was the first team activity they'd done in over 5 years. I hadn't suggested this. In the 5 members of the team, that was the first team activity they'd done in over a year. I hadn't suggested this. I just quietly picked up 1 or 2 pieces of litter every day on my walk. A small daily incremental improvement, Kaizen. A new bin appeared, as you can see on the screen, and a new cigarette butt disposal point was added. The manager, who I think had thought, why on earth have I got this health and wellbeing consultant in and all she's doing is walking around site picking up crisp packets, began to report a better sense of community within the team. There seemed to be a renewed respect for the workplace. Without any specific direction, the team changed how they were working together and people were better organised. The team began to arrive at work on time, they were more respectful of each other, they showed more interest in projects and customer deadlines. And the manager introduced a large notice board where people could add their suggestions for improvements, and then they were given permission to try these out. So there's that psychological safety and that empowerment piece. And successful suggestions were then implemented across the wider company. The manager reported more respect, more engagement, more ease within the team. So what I want to say to you is, if you're thinking of the 4 pillars, if you're thinking happy, healthy, safe and engaged, how do I improve this in my workplace? I recommend starting with Kaizen. 1 small incremental change that you can build day in, day out. So thank you so much. You are very welcome to ask me questions. Mark, we have time now, but I'm also going to leave my contact details there if you want to get in touch with me, or if you think of questions afterwards. I'm on Instagram, where I share conversations I have during the week with different companies. And if you ever want to read any of my writing, then I'm at Steph Fitzgerald.
Thank you very much. Brilliant again. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I have some questions for you. Beatrice asks, how can you help organizations prioritize well-being when workload is high?
Oh gosh, that to me comes straight back to that fuel for your engine point. So it's not getting them to see it as an added addition. It's getting them to understand and explaining to them, we will only achieve these high workloads if everyone is well. It's such a good point, because so often the conversation is flipped and people sort of work themselves into a frenzy and then say, and we should do something about well-being. And it's like, no, if you've got a long uphill climb ahead, if your workload is steep and it's not diminishing, you have to prioritize your well-being. So absolutely, I would be tempted to have that conversation with them ASAP and say, right, well-being is the fuel for our engine. It is not the nice to have add-on. We don't fill the tank afterwards, we do it first.
Great, thank you. Francesca raises an interesting point. How can you combine the different needs of office and manufacturing workers in the same space, when you're managing well-being?
I think that's so important. I think there's a real unspoken privilege in well-being, actually, where a lot of well-being strategies suit office workers, but they don't work for manufacturers. So I'm a big fan of meaningful feedback, so I would talk to both elements before you make any decisions, but also always have your frontline workers in mind, so your manufacturer, your shop floor, whatever it may be, your production workers in mind, because wellbeing strategies can really grate. So I'll give an example. I went to a fantastic conference where the head of HR was very proudly talking about senior leaders being encouraged to share stories of going to flexing their hours. They were sort of trying to advertise their flexible working as a wellbeing strategy, and they were sharing senior leaders leaving to go and collect their children from school. And all I could think of was all my manufacturer colleagues who are on trade union mandated shift patterns, who would love to leave early to go and get their kids, who would love to see their children after school, go and, you know, have that excitement at the school gate and get those extra hugs. And I just thought, this is a real example of swing and a miss. So I would definitely be considering your manufacturer workers almost ahead of office workers, because what works for them will work for everyone else, but also just recognise that unspoken privilege. There's definitely a need to make sure you're supporting everyone, not just those that have access to a company laptop or phone.
Great, thank you. I appreciate the acknowledgement of the weight being put on layers of managers right now, and I see this in my own client organisation. How can we propose solutions to clients who seem resistant to using up valuable time or using up time on these programs, relationship building moments or trainings?
Yeah, so again, I think it comes down to me for those, start really small. So it's small but persistent, right? So it's almost like that water droplet getting through rock, right? The first tiny change isn't going to feel terribly impactful, and you might think, you know, I want to go in there and smash the rock. And what I would say is just drip, 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 1% improvements. People are more willing to get on board with them. They don't feel overwhelming. It's not something else for people to understand or utilize. It's just doable. And so once you start building on those, I do think that's where you see really consistent change, and it gathers its own momentum. So even if it feels frustratingly small to start with, I promise that it will build and you'll see big results.
Great, thank you. Lorraine raises the issue which everyone's talking about. How do you think the move towards a more hybrid style of working impacts people's health and well-being? And is there anything in particular we should do to maximize positive and minimize negative impacts of this?
Yeah, great question, right? Because hybrid working is everywhere at the moment. We're all thinking about it. So I'm a big fan of choice wherever possible. And I think choice can be applied to all kinds of different workplace settings. It's not just office workers, but I think wherever there is choice and flexibility, that's essential, and it helps people to manage their own health and well-being. So I think we touched on this earlier, Mark, but I would identify myself as what I call an ambivert. So I'm neither extrovert or introvert, I'm a bit of both. So whilst I love doing things like this, I then sometimes need, and I love going into the office sometimes and seeing my colleagues, sometimes I just need to be quiet and need to withdraw. I need to recharge my batteries in my office on my own. And so I love having that flexibility for I can be in and see people and be sociable and get uplifted from others, but I can also withdraw when I need to, and that helps me manage my health and well-being. Where we see it go wrong is mandated. So if you were considering a mandated return to the office 5 days a week, no questions asked, no considerations given, I would strongly advise you to rethink that. And in terms of what you need to do with hybrid working, you need to check in more, because I do think that certainly during the pandemic, when we were remote working, we were overwhelmed. We can all put a mask on for an hour on a Zoom call, but actually it's when we come off that Zoom call, we might be completely overwhelmed. We could be tearful. We could have all sorts going on. So we check in more.
Great, thank you. Julie asks, what successful strategies have you seen where organizations implemented small changes that had a significant and long-lasting impact? Low cost, no cost, ideally.
Yes, I love that. Well, low cost, no cost is definitely my bag. So I'm a big fan of that approach. I think definitely solutions that were bespoke. That's the first thing I'd say. So not trying to copy another organization or thinking, oh, you know, that works really well. And I think sometimes when we see big successful companies, we think, let's do what they do. So I would say something that's really bespoke and really needed. So an example of something that I created in one of the NHS trusts I worked in was we converted, this sounds terrible, but I promise it's better than it sounded. We converted what was essentially a big cupboard and made it into a tea station. And our nurses had a station that was right in the centre of the ward. So they were trying to have a break or a cup of tea and it was open. It was also where the only computer station was. So you'd be trying to have a break, but you'd have other people trying to upload paperwork. And so just a really simple repurposing of a cupboard, which we made into like a little tea cubby, gave people somewhere to actually have a break and not be interrupted. So low cost, no cost, massive difference to well-being, and also significant drop in sickness absence, because I think people actually just got to have a break during the day.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to ask the last question now. Kasia, thank you for your question. How do you deal with senior leaders who don't understand the importance of the employee experience and how it contributes to the culture? In turn, they don't want to make any effort, time, or give any money to make even the smallest improvements. The lack of caring is the norm. Kasia, that's a tough question.
It's a tough question, but sadly it's a very common one, right? So how do I deal with those senior leaders? I speak their language. So if I'm talking to the chief financial officer, I talk money and I tell them about how much it's going to save them. I give all the globally applicable and the evidence-based research to support my arguments. If I'm talking to HR, I talk about the impact on people policies. If I'm talking to Occ Health, then I talk about the health impact. I think it's really important to flex your language for your senior leadership team, but also it's worth letting them know, and again, using the research to back this up, they don't really have an option. 2/3 of employees at the moment would take a pay cut for better health and well-being. So it's really important that if they are interested in talent retention in the future, they don't have an option to go, well, I don't care about health and well-being. People aren't at work to be happy. Well, guess what? You're not going to have any more working for you if you keep that up. So I think a bit of evidence-based, gentle nudging, maybe subtly leave it on their desk, could be the way forward.
Been really interesting. I was wondering what the best way to support people who are feeling overwhelmed due to their own life difficulties to help them feel happier and safer at work. And thank you, Lynn, for that question.
I think that's such a great question. And actually, I think work can become a bit of a safe space if we do it in the right way. I think when home life is very challenging, then I think actually work can become our safe space where we can support and really promote people's health and well-being, really focus on those pillars. I think when people have challenges outside of work, we need to recognise that those are going to impact, so we can't separate the two. And often people say to me, well, it's not a work-related issue, so I shouldn't get involved. But actually, it's making sure that it's comfortable for the employee and that you meet them at the level they need to be met rather than making assumptions. So what I would say, and I've said before, I don't like this sort of onus on managers and, you know, we're sort of training managers to be pseudo-therapists or whatever we're doing. What I would start with is asking the employee if they're happy to share what situation are they in, what impact is that having on them, and what are they doing about it. And then our job really is to get out of the way. So for example, let's say I've had a bereavement at home and I'm struggling to focus and I'm really challenged by it. What I'm doing about it is seeking appropriate therapy. What my workplace can do to get out of the way is maybe flex my hours so that I can attend that therapy during work time. That may be the only time my therapist is free, for example. So it's not what can I do about it? What can I lift off you immediately? Let me take that problem from you, which I think we're all a bit guilty of doing because we're trying to be helpful. But it can be quite disempowering for the person who's struggling, and particularly if someone's feeling a bit overwhelmed or unable to cope, leaping in and coming up with lots of suggestions that they've probably already tried or that won't work for them can be very disempowering. So I would start with those questions. What situation are you in? What impact is it having on you? And what are you doing about it? And then thinking with them, how can I get out of the way?
Thank you very much. Marian's raised the word that I don't think you actually mentioned in the talk, is hybrid working. A couple of questions about hybrid working. Has
Yes.
hybrid working contributed to any change in colleague well-being? And what do managers need to be doing in a hybrid world to catch early signs of drops in well-being?
I think that's a great question. So yes, I definitely think we've seen a change in well-being. I think much as everything to do with our health, one size does not fit all. So some people have loved hybrid working. I think it comes down to choice and having variety, enough flex in your approach for choice. What I find really interesting with these sort of return mandates to the office is the disregarding of existing data. And you know, I'm an evidence-based practitioner, so of course I'm always very hot on the data. But when your employees are performing well, they're productive, they're happy, they're healthy, they're enjoying their job, they're able to better manage their work-life balance. And then we say to them, oh, actually, forget all that, go back to your horrendous commute with massive cost implications at the height of a financial crisis. And then why are you complaining? Why are you looking elsewhere? Then I think we need to be very open to that. So I do think hybrid working has really helped. I do think the key is hybrid. And I know we've talked about this a lot on Millennial webinars before, but I do think hybrid is key rather than forced remote or forced back in the office. I think giving people that flexibility and choice. So I'm someone who really identifies as an ambivert. So I don't know if you've come across that, but I'm part introvert, part extrovert. I love doing things like this, but I then take a bit of time to sort of recharge my batteries. And so some days I really want to be in the office and be around people and have that stimulation. Other times I just need to, you know, sort of huddle at home and just be with my dogs and just be in this office and just sort of take my time. So I think for me, that hybrid working works really well, and it's choice. It allows me to manage my mood and manage my well-being as I need to. In terms of checking in with people when they're hybrid working, how do I spot those early signs? It is asking more often. So we can't see what's going on in here, we have to ask. But also what I would say is in some countries from a medical legal perspective, we're quite restricted in what we can ask. We're not allowed to get too personal. In some countries, if people have sick days, we're not allowed to know why. So I'm a big fan of not waiting for disclosure and proactively sharing resources. So if at every team meeting you end, for example, by saying, mindful that we've got some pretty stressful timelines, don't forget we've got our EAP, we've got OC Health, we've got all these avenues of support, don't forget to take good care of yourself, let me know if I can support in any way. You're not waiting for disclosure, you're not waiting for someone to come to you and say, what are those resources again, or help me, but you're normalizing the conversation to the point where maybe someone who needs that help and support can have access to it. And I think that's really key.
And Alia, you talked about just a minute. You talked about kind of taking a breather and getting your strength back. And Alia says, "How do we ourselves try to fill our tanks if our employers cannot?"
Oh, it's such a good question. And I think particularly as a leader, our happiness, it's a bit like being a parent without meaning to offer a strange analogy. I think we're only as happy as our unhappiest child. And I think as a team leader or a manager, sometimes we're only as happy as our unhappiest employee. So if everyone on the team is happy and working well and they're safe, they're engaged, they're thriving, we can think, yay, we can feel really good in ourselves. But if someone is really struggling, that can really impact on us. It's a very well-known saying, but what I will say is that you cannot pour from an empty cup. So you need to think about your own fitness to practice as a manager. And that's not to scold yourself and say, you should be at 100% all the time, but it's recognizing when you're fluctuating, when your energy is dipping, when you're being dragged down, and it's managing those interactions. And sometimes it's having a level of transparency. So I'm not a big fan of, full disclosure about everything. I think it can make people quite uncomfortable. And I think as a psychologist, it's good to practice, professional boundaries. However, I think you can say to someone, my energy is really fluctuating this week, or I don't have quite as much oomph this week as I would typically. So I'm going to reduce our meeting times, or I'm going to manage my diary differently to support myself this week. So, and I actually think that's really positive role modeling for people, that they get to understand, oh, I've got this option to flex. I can work differently. It's not about running my engine and my gas tank down to zero. I can take time to refuel. And I think that's a particular priority for a manager.
Stephanie, thank you very much for a fantastic session. Really enjoyed that. There will be a follow-up email to everyone, and we look forward to that. Do check the link for future events. Stephanie, thank you very much. Your thank you comes in the form of comments in the chat box and a few emojis flying up in the air. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you everyone. Take care. Stay happy, healthy, safe and engaged.